going to try to shed perhaps a different angle on, or complementary angle on what we heard before, because I hear a lot, for example, about the growth of renewable energy, but little is said about at the expense of what. And especially, so if we look at electricity, and this is what I'm going to focus on today in the selected key countries and region, you can see that the share of certain fuels have been quite stubborn. So if you look at fossil fuels, if you compare 1985 with 2019, I mean, the share of coal has hardly changed. As you can see, this kind of flat line. Yes, the share of oil has been going down, but it has been captured by natural gas. And the share of renewable has been increasing, but this has come primarily at, maybe they absorb partly of the oil decline, but it's mainly the decline in nuclear energy and actually a little bit in hydropower. So we have to be very careful when you're talking about a growth in certain fuels and ask ourselves, it's coming at the expense of what other fuel? Because at the end, I mean, they all have to add up to 100% of our primary energy mix. And here in terms of electricity production by fuel. So that's what's important to realize, because that's what something that happened here in Germany where I'm sitting, where they end up replacing green with green and not really green with or fossil fuel with green. So that's one first observation I want to make. And then I'm going to look at certain regions, because when you talk about, first of all, net zero, I spent some time actually, and that would be my next homework. I got quite intrigued after I prepared for this presentation to find one comprehensive universal definition of net zero, and I couldn't find. So for me, it's still work in progress. You find, a bit of differences here and there. I'm going to show you the example, for example, in China, when you read between the lines in terms of their commitment. But also the other thing that we should consider is the energy transitions. That's why there was an S in the title, energy transitions, rather than just one energy transition, because you have different regions and different countries, as you all know, going at different speed. And that might actually be amplified further post-COVID. I'll come back to that point in a minute. But if you look at the electricity generation by fuel type, I mean, mainly the OECD countries, US and the EU as a region, you can see quite diversified energy mix. And perhaps the EU stands out because the EU has perhaps the most aggressive climate change policies. But in the rest of the world, whether in China, maybe to a lesser extent, Africa, but definitely in the Middle East, which really stands out because it is the least diversified region, whether in terms of electricity generation or energy mix. You can see, however, that there is no coal here. It's mainly oil and gas, and China, it's primarily coal, as we heard from previous speakers. Now, I've highlighted, I want to focus on the three regions and countries where you have the highest, who are the main contributors to our to carbon emissions. And I look at the EU as a bloc and the US. So you can see in both cases, the trends have been towards a decline in CO2 emissions. So they have done a great job. But I'm going to show you later that to meet the targets that they are telling us, or they have set, especially, for example, the Biden administration quite recently, they need to triple the efforts that they did since 1990 to achieve those targets. Whereas China, you can see those emissions continue to rise. So let's look first quite rapidly at Europe. So I took Europe because I included the UK, but here the EU plus the UK, you can see that, yes, definitely it's very nicely diversified, and you can see greener energy with nuclear, hydro, and renewable energy. So it's quite, it's playing an important role. However, when you break down that picture by country, you can see really that underneath this trend, there is a multi-speed energy region when it comes to the interplay of fuel. And here, for me, two countries stand out, Germany and Poland. And you can see in Poland the massive dominance of coal in power generation. And the same can be said in Germany, where actually instead of ending up having more renewable energy for power generation, when Germany decided to turn its back on nuclear power, actually that came at the expense of, it did not result with more renewable energy. It resulted actually with more fossil fuel. And just to throw at you one number, if I can remember it correctly, that together Germany and Poland account for more than 60% of coal power generation in the EU. So that's one thing to bear in mind when you talk about the EU and the energy transition in the EU. It's not going at the same speed. Now, if you look at the targets of the EU, that they want to be climate neutral by 2050, you can see that they have achieved a lot since 1990, 23% reductions. But whatever has been accomplished to date has to be done now roughly 3 times faster to achieve that target. Now, in power generation, of course, to lower greenhouse gas emissions, it's no-brainer. You have to target coal, which is the dirtiest of fossil fuel. But if you want to replace, ideally you would want to replace it with renewable, but we are all aware of the problems related to renewable energy. That is mainly the variability or the variation in the utilization rate, as they depend on primarily on weather condition, at least under today's conditions from a technology and storage perspective. So there is really a great opportunity for natural gas, because not only, as Thomas said, it's much cleaner than coal, and it emits almost, more than 40% less carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour, but it can also complement wind and solar. And what I found fascinating, because I always knew that, okay, you need this kind of a backup, but I didn't know that it was literally almost minute-to-minute fluctuations in the output of solar and wind can be met by natural gas. So here I took the, I'm very influenced by Germany because I'm sitting here because of the restrictions on travel in Germany, but you can see the fluctuations in wind and solar. And I took a period where you would expect at least a lot of wind, definitely maybe not a lot of sunshine. And here you can see gas generation. Actually, if you put them together, you can see that whenever the wind was not blowing, natural gas kicked in to support that kind of backup generation. And this is why it leads me to talk about how the energy transition, in my opinion, is not about less integration between fossil fuel and non-fossil fuel. It's more integration, but I don't see the discussion going into that direction, at least not for the foreseeable future. This is not being talked about. So there is a clear case for natural gas to replace coal, and actually we run the number for the EU. And we found that if you go for a complete switch, and by the way, the infrastructure is there in the EU for natural gas, so you're not going to install things from scratch. So that is an opportunity, a golden opportunity in the EU. So if you use that infrastructure fully and you have this complete utilization switch from coal and oil in some places to gas, you would achieve carbon dioxide reduction equivalent to 6 years worth of annual reduction rate of CO2. If you do the same in terms of replacing coal and oil with renewables, then you are looking at almost double that period. So definitely there is a strong case in terms of speed that supports the push for greater use of natural gas in the EU. But I believe that the energy transition in Europe as a whole will be mainly a story about gas and modern renewables. However, that's the climate rationale and maybe the economic rationale to a certain extent, but there is also another side of the story, and the political dimension come into play, and that raises some question marks about the future of natural gas in Europe. Primarily, the pressure in some member states to protect coal mining jobs, especially when coal is in remote areas or disadvantaged regions with long and proud local traditions. The issue of security of supply concerns, where some countries don't want to increase their dependence mainly on Russia, so therefore they would like to stick more to something domestically homegrown and safer. And there is the all-important carbon pricing, which is not high enough to encourage this kind of switching from coal to gas. So there is a strong case for natural gas in Europe, but there is no guarantee that the switch from coal to gas will happen, though I have the feeling that given the aggressive policies in the EU, we might see a stronger push than what I'm trying to convey here, but we should be aware of these kind of question marks and uncertainties. Let me turn quickly to China. And as I said earlier, we have to be aware of the targets announced by different countries around the world, because when you look at these targets, you realize that the way they have been framed make actually comparison between policies and objectives quite difficult, because a small difference in the definition or in the like here, I'm sure in the case of China, can lead to a different outcome. So, for example, we have the Chinese economy. Their aim, the Chinese government has revised its commitments and make them tougher. So they want to achieve a 65% reduction in carbon intensity from 2005 levels compared to previously 60% made in 2015. However, so this may seem ambitious, but when you talk about carbon intensity, which is per unit of GDP, so you are depending that on more or less like something like a variable like GDP, then the country is retaining some flexibility. And here is one difference with other countries. For example, many advanced economies have committed to a reduction of carbon emissions in absolute terms. However, with China, by choosing carbon intensity target, this could be actually achieved if GDP slows down. And so in this case, carbon emissions would not be reduced as strongly as you may have thought just by looking at this target on the surface. And if you look at their 5-year plan, the 14th 5-year plan, which was approved last month, it was very interesting to see that they did not really set a numerical GDP growth target, unlike tradition. So this can hint to some perhaps maybe less optimistic future for GDP, and that would translate to a lower than expected carbon emissions target. But there are also other things that caught my attention when I look at the 14th 5-year plan in China. It had 2 specific targets, energy related, that actually could slow down, could actually question the growth in natural gas. Now, we are all expecting, because natural gas at the moment plays a very small role in the primary energy mix in China and in the electricity mix. So we are all hoping that there will be great push from to switch from coal to gas in China. But again, there is uncertainty there, partly because of the commitment to increase nuclear power generation. So that will come at the expense of something else, and we're not quite sure what that will be. But second, while they say they want to achieve 20% of primary energy consumption from non-fossil fuel by 2025, they don't actually cap the consumption of coal, which means that that could also come at the expense of natural gas. The other thing that is important to remember about China is that although they introduced carbon pricing mechanism like the trading scheme that you have in the EU, however, I mean, it's still early days, but the prices that we are seeing there are pretty low to incentivize coal to gas switching. And the other thing is that depends, again, there is a big question mark about domestic supply. So if domestic supply in China for gas doesn't pick up, this means that China is going to depend more and more on imports. And we saw in 2020 how China actually became the largest, if I'm not mistaken, LNG importer. And that had implications on prices. So here, if China continues to grow its dependence on import, that would translate into higher gas prices, then that will slower the shift from the more competitive coal to gas. And then finally, there was an interesting study which talked about a technical side, that they say that under existing conditions, the maximum technical potential to switch from coal to gas, at least for the next 5 years in China, is limited to 9% of current coal generation level. So lots of question marks about the future, at least the midterm outlook for natural gas in China, the switching between coal and gas, it may not be as we are hoping for, with implications on the net zero targets, on climate change targets, etc. But let me
sorry to interrupt. I'll
yes.
have to, if you have only 1 minute left.
Yeah, and I'm concluding this and this, but anyway, I'm just going to show the US success story. They did a pretty great job with the reduction in carbon emissions, and that came primarily because of the increase in renewables, but even more so of natural gas, thanks to the shale revolution. You can see how natural gas squeezed coal in power generation. But I want to highlight one last point, that the Biden administration's new ambitious carbon emissions targets require, like the EU, a tripling of the effort that they have achieved in the since 1990. And that again, but there, I think there is a greater chance for gas, because of pricing mechanism more than anything else, and the domestic production, to make this kind of target achievable.